According to an article on BBC Future, in the course of a day, the average person in a Western city is exposed to as much data as someone in the 15th century would encounter in their entire life. And almost all of that information can be found through a tiny device we keep in our pocket. There's no need to remember it, we just have to remember how to find it. So why are we still obsessed as a society with remembering things? Most people wish they had a better memory. By and large, most of the jobs people want require them to have passed exams, and those exams require them to remember loads of things. That's okay. But I don't think in 10 years' time the world's most exciting companies will be particularly interested in the fact you can remember stuff. They're already more interested in creativity than qualifications. And that, it turns out, is why memory really matters, because memory provides the raw material for creativity. Many of the most difficult problems in the world are best solved by trying as many things as possible and seeing what works. The more you've learned and remembered, the more things you can try out when you're trying to solve a problem, and the more likely you are to find answers that no one else has been able to find. And being able to do that is the most important skill there's going to be in the next few decades. Memory doesn't matter because it means you can do well in quizzes, or even exams, though it will help with those things. Memory matters because it helps you to have more ideas, and more original ideas. What we're going to look at here is the most effective way for people to improve their memory. It's called the Memory Palace method, or Memory Journey, or Mind Palace, and it involves forming links in your imagination between things you don't know and want to learn, and things you already know really well. It's a technique that was first used over 2,000 years ago, and was used widely for hundreds of years until the 1600s, and has started to be used again in the last few decades by students, business people, and memory athletes, who use it to perform remarkable feats like memorizing a deck of cards in under 15 seconds, or learning thousands of numbers in order in under an hour. I'll show you how to create your own memory palace, and use it to learn facts or lists, and I'll teach you how to learn any numbers, however long they are, like really long passwords, or however many of them there are, like dates or facts and figures from a subject or a hobby, by turning those numbers into memorable images using a simple code. People have been finding inventive ways to memorize things for thousands of years. The Memory Palace technique, which uses the buildings and spaces that we already know to help us remember things we want to learn by linking them together, originated, as far as we know, in ancient Greece. According to legend, in the 6th century BC, the poet Simonides of Chios was at a dinner party and popped outside when an earthquake destroyed the building where the party was being held. When people were trying to work out who had been at the gathering to help them look for bodies, Simonides was able to help. In his head, he went around the table, seeing in his mind's eye who had been sitting where. The art of memorizing by linking the people or objects to be memorized with a specific place was born. Several hundred years later, the Roman speaker, writer and politician Cicero wrote in detail about the technique. He devised rules for the creation of the ideal places to which you could link things. These were based upon the public squares and buildings to be found in Rome at the time. Cicero and his followers would go through the streets of Rome, committing the columns, doors and walls of the buildings they found there to memory. That was the birth of what we would call the Memory Palace. Cicero used those buildings to remember the materials from which he constructed his most famous speeches, memorizing little chunks of speech and appropriate factoids in a way he could recall them at any time and put them into the best order. Is very similar to the way memory palaces are used today. And the techniques as a whole are incredibly similar to the techniques battle rappers used to prepare their freestyle raps. And then, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, memory palaces became an object of intense study. This was a time when many of the world's greatest scholars only had access to the handwritten books they could find in libraries. In order to be able to use the things they learned to impress the royal houses of Europe as they travelled across the continent, they needed a way to remember what they had read. Being able to do this using memory palaces could give them incredible power and reputation. One of the most famous users of the memory palace technique was the Italian philosopher and occultist Giordano Bruno. He even came to Oxford in 1583 and talked to scholars here about his techniques. They were horrified. Some things about Oxford never really change. One of the things that really horrified them was that instead of using buildings, like many Renaissance memorists did, Giordano Bruno used astrological charts as his fixed point for remembering things. This made sense. Astrology was a mainstream science in many places at the time, and the zodiac star charts were among the most commonly used sets of knowledges that there were, rather like the periodic table, for example, might be today. Unfortunately for Bruno, many years later the Catholic Church concurred that there was something suspicious about the way he did things, and he was executed. And then, not long after Bruno had been burnt to death for heresy, people stopped using this technique so widely. Part of that was down to the increasing availability of printed books, meaning people didn't need to learn things so thoroughly. There's a lesson there for anyone tempted to bemoan the fact the internet has stopped people learning. That argument is at least half a millennium old. It was a poor argument against technology then, and it remains one now. There is also a more sinister suspicion of the technique. As we've seen, Giordano Bruno used astrological charts for his memory palaces. It was details like that, combined with a general fear of the imagination, of conjuring images in one's head, especially from the Puritans, that led, rather like the reactions of later audiences to magicians, to the use of memory palaces being considered some kind of witchcraft. And so it fell out of use as a technique for hundreds of years, until the memory palace came back into fashion as a way of memorizing things, with the rise of memory competitions. Memory competitions now happen across the world. There's even a Netflix documentary called Memory Games about them, which I would thoroughly recommend. And these memory athletes discovered very quickly that the most effective way of remembering was the ancient technique of the memory palace. To give an example of just how effective it is, the world record for memorizing a deck of cards in order is 13.96 seconds, and 616 numbers have been memorized in order in just 5 minutes using this technique. And businesses have realized that memory is actually a really important skill for people to have, because it's not just about learning things so you can show off or don't have to use Wikipedia. Just like Cicero used memory palaces to help him compose original and sometimes improvised speeches, so people can use them to help find innovative solutions to problems or come up with new products, as well as helping with communication skills. And training your memory, using the memory palace technique, can actually change the structure of your brain in ways that could make you more creative. One of the most famous studies in neuroscience looked at the brains of black cab drivers in London. As part of your training to become a cab driver, you have to do what's called the knowledge, learning not just the whole map of London, but how to use it to find the shortest route between any two places. A study showed that doing this actually changes the structure of the brain. It increases the amount of grey matter in the hippocampus in the brain. This slide shows the actual after scans from the study, and you can see on each brain section there's an orange area where the extra growth is. That's the same part of the brain that's found to be larger in really creative people. Then a few years ago, a memory athlete called Boris Conrad, who also happens to be a neuroscientist, carried out a similar experiment involving people trained to use the memory palace technique. And his team found the same thing. Training using memory palaces changes the structure of the brain in this area, in the same way as it does for cab drivers who have trained with the knowledge. It looks as though it might be the case that using memory palaces to train your memory really does make you more creative. There are two things that make for a really good memory palace. First, you need something you know really well, and not just that, but something that has some kind of logical order to it so that you can move around it and memorize things in order. That's why a lot of people use a journey they know well. And second, you need something that you're going to find it easy to associate with other things. These associations are formed by having the things you want to mention or to remember interact with a place in your imagination, or do something that calls that place to mind. You can make these associations easier to remember by following a couple of simple principles. First of all, animate them. Have the things you want to remember interact with each other and their surroundings. And second, exaggerate them. If you want to remember, say, a box full of seaweed, don't just picture looking in the box and seeing a couple of bits of kelp. Have the closed box shaking and wobbling because it's ready to burst and then explode, sending seaweed everywhere. So, okay, Let's build a very simple memory palace and use it to memorize a list of objects. You can use any room or building or journey you want as we do this, but so that we're all talking about the same thing, I'm going to be using places from the ancient Mediterranean world, and there are two reasons for this. First, places on a map, visited in the order that you would visit them on a map, make an ideal memory palace or journey because they are already not only connected to each other, but connected in a certain order. And that makes going back and finding the things you want to remember, in the right order, much easier. And second, the Mediterranean World Gallery in the Ashmolean is somewhere I've used in the past for in-person workshops, and it works really well. And it has the added bonus that it's here in Oxford, so when museums are open again, you can go and expand on the beginning we're making here. So here is a map of the Mediterranean, with 6 main locations from the gallery marked. There's Rome, Venice, Constantinople, Cairo, Alexandria, and Sicily. So let's look at how to turn that into a really effective memory palace. We can make it a lot easier to remember which objects we have placed at which locations by giving those locations distinctive features. And this goes back to the principles of exaggeration and animation we noted earlier. So what we're going to do is take something that each of these cities is known for, and then, in our heads, we're going to focus on making that thing as vivid and detailed and as extreme as we possibly can. And that will make it easier for us to drop objects into it and remember the connection between them. And we'll remember the order of the list from the position of the cities on the map. So let's start with Rome and work clockwise. For each city, we need to find an image that's really easy to remember and which we can use to store the things we want to remember. For Rome, let's imagine the Colosseum. When we come to store our images, we'll place them inside the Colosseum, with one image attacking the other like a gladiator about to win a fight. Venice is best known for its canals, which people travel on in gondolas like this. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, is the city that spans both Europe and Asia via the incredible Galata Bridge, which you can see here. Cairo is a city that's home to the world's most famous pyramids, while Alexandria was home to one of the greatest libraries there's ever been. And, if you've been watching the news recently, you'll know one of the things Sicily is most famous for, the volcano, Mount Etna. So now we have our very simple memory palace, made of a map with 6 cities. Let's use it to remember something. One of the things you will most often want to remember are numbers. These might be telephone numbers, numerical passwords, or dates of events. And just practicing remembering numbers is a great form of mental exercise to help you stay sharp and perform your best. It's the mental equivalent of doing push-ups or lifting weights. You might not spend your life doing competitive push-ups, though you might, but practicing push-ups will help you with a wide range of physical activities you want to do better every day. And memorizing numbers can do the same for your brain. Memory athletes have spent a long time developing really efficient ways of memorizing numbers. Almost all of them work by converting numbers into letters and then those letters into words. And we're going to learn the most commonly used of those techniques, known as the major system. It works like this. For every number from 0 to 9, a consonant is assigned, or a consonant sound as follows. 0 is S or Z, 1 is T or D, 2 is N, 3 is M, 4 is R, 5 is L, 6 is a J or Ch sound, 7 is K or G, 8 is F or V, and 9 is P or B. From this conversion of numbers to letters, every 2-digit number from 00 to 99 is converted to a word, which either just has 2 consonant sounds, corresponding to the 2 numbers, or starts with those 2. For example, 53 corresponds to an L followed by an M, so either lime or lemon would be perfectly good words to use to remember it using these principles. You could also use people and have the letters as their initials. So in this case, for example, Oxford's Member of Parliament, Layla Moran. When you want to remember a long number, you divide it into groups of 2 digits. So the number 4930518351940577637128990 is broken down to become 49, 30, 51, 83, 51, 94, 05, 77, 63, 71, 28 and 90, where each number becomes a word, and this might give you the words rope, and then moose, light, foam, light again, berry, sail, cake, jam, cat, knife and bus, following the principle we used earlier of associating two objects with every place in your memory palace. You can group the numbers together to be remembered like this. Now, we can use just 6 places in our memory palace to remember these 24 numbers, by connecting each pair of objects with the appropriate place in our memory palace, and by having them interact with each other, so that you will be able to remember the order within the pair. At Rome, in the Colosseum, we imagine a gladiator with a rope lassoing a moose. On the Galata Bridge, or when we get to Venice, there's a giant light shining on the canal, and everywhere we look, there's foam. On the Galata Bridge in Constantinople, again, there's a light shining, and this time it reveals that the whole bridge is covered in berries. At the library, at the pyramids in Cairo, there's a sail flapping from the top of the pyramid, and drawn on the sail is a picture of a giant cake. Then, when you get to Alexandria, you can see a pot of jam on one of the tables in the library, and then a cat leaps onto the table, as cats do, and spills the jam everywhere. And finally, on Sicily, Mount Etna is erupting, but instead of lava, it is erupting with knives, and one of them falls out of the sky, and as it lands it cuts a bus in half. And then, if we want to recall the 24 numbers in order, we simply retrace our steps from the beginning, starting in Rome, and discover each of the scenes we have created in turn, and then take the images created in them and convert them back into numbers. And so we go from the rope and the moose to the light and the foam, the light and the berry, the sail with a cake on it, the jam being knocked over by the cat, and finally the knives cutting the bus in half. You don't have to use a map to create your memory palace. You can use, for example, your journey to school, or rooms where you live, shops in a shopping centre, basically anything you remember really well where you can follow the things in order.